There are so many important themes in Invisible Man, and here's an in-depth explanation of two of them. The first one is invisibility. Obviously, it's important considering the title is Invisible Man. So this is a major theme throughout the book, and it is shown through the narrator's struggle with his identity and race. This theme of invisibility reflects Ellison's time period because blacks weren't really seen as important or relevant in that time. It was harder for a person of color to succeed or achieve anything because they had the stigma of slavery and brutality carried with them all the time. The narrator wasn't ever really seen in the novel unless he was speaking or with a white person. He was thrown in with a group and had no sense of individuality, which made it hard for him to discover his identity. At the end of the book, he realizes that he is invisible, but he can still be impactful. This is Ellison's way of judging society's standards for importance, but also recognizing that you can make a difference without being seen. And there are obviously many examples of invisibility in the book, and here are a couple of them. The first one is found on page 7. It says, "Without light, I am not only invisible, but formless as well. And to be unaware of one's form is to live a death. I, myself, after existing some 20 years, did not become alive until I discovered my invisibility." So this is the narrator, and it's in the prologue that he's saying this, and he's kind of just giving it an introduction into what the rest of the book is going to be, and he's talking about how when he discovered that he was invisible is when he was able to kind of find who he was, get his identity, and he was able to make a difference that way. Another example is found on page 143. This is Bledsoe talking to the narrator. He says, "You're nobody's son. You don't exist. Can't you see that?" So this is one of the first times that someone is pointing out to the narrator himself that he is invisible, that he's important, because up to that point, the narrator had these goals for himself, and he believed that he could do what he wanted to do. He could be like Bledsoe. But then here Bledsoe is telling him, "You're invisible. Nobody can see you, and nobody really cares," which really kind of changed the narrator's way of thinking. The next example is found on page 168. It says, "Still I felt that even when they were polite, they hardly saw me, that they would have begged the pardon of Jack the Bear, never glancing his way if the bear happened to be walking along, minding his business." So the narrator is in New York now, and he's kind of just reflecting on how just because people maybe acknowledge him or ask, like, say, "Excuse me," or being polite, it doesn't mean they actually see him. It doesn't mean that they recognize that he is a person and that, he has a purpose, he has a life. So here is another point where he's kind of realizing that he is invisible, that no one necessarily really cares about him or what he does. He's just kind of there, but also not even there because the people can't really see him. The next example is on page 507. It says, "Well, I was, and yet I was invisible. That was the fundamental contradiction. I was, and yet I was unseen." So this is towards the end of the book, and the narrator is kind of really figuring out now that he is invisible, and he is kind of reflecting on that, and he's just seeing that he is invisible. He exists, but he's not seen, and it just usually those don't go hand in hand, but that's how he is living. That's what his life is, and that's just one of the points where he's recognizing that, and he is kind of coming to terms with it. So those are some really main examples of the invisibility in Invisible Man. The next theme is race and racism. So when the main character is an African American in the 1930s, there's bound to be a theme revolving around race in the book. Starting with a battle royale at the beginning of the novel, in which young black men are degraded and used as entertainment, there are obvious signs of racial inequality there. Mr. Norton and some of the white members of the Brotherhood are unintentionally racist, while others like Brother Jack are intentionally racist. There's also the issue of race in relation to identity, which the narrator struggles with throughout the book. And Ellison uses the theme of race to show the different ways racism was portrayed in the time period and to point it out to those blind to it. He also uses it to judge those blacks who are subservient and those whites who manipulate. He essentially states through the narrator that race and racism are issues that one has to figure out himself and do what he can to combat it.